those of you on the, it's gonna be strange, on the far left, depending on the reason this text here is really important, because we're going to be using the scriptures quite regularly. So if you're having trouble reading that, you may want to relocate. And if not, then maybe I'll just assume you have it memorized, and we'll all be good on that. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for the words through which your word is spoken. We pray that you'll enrich our souls this morning. Speak through and past me, that we might learn more about your will for us and who you are and who you want us to be. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Now, first of all, a little warning here. I'm playing horn with the choir today, so I've got to bug out at 25 after. And so you'll have a blessedly brief, briefer lesson today. When Tony mentioned that he wanted me to talk about the parables, I just kind of and I think I delayed my response for a little while because of that. Because at Catawba, in the New Testament class, the introduction, I don't go very deeply into the parables themselves. I just have to choose what I consider to be the most important things. And yet I always lament that because I remember actually a course in college when we actually had to write our own parables. And actually probably next week I'll ask you to begin thinking about that. So just a heads up, this is a warning before the assignment is actually given. Anyway, so my pause was there because I thought I really don't have anything right ready to hand on this. And so he made me research. He actually made me work for this, which I know is hard to believe at times, but and it was a ball. I remember the fun I had when I wrote my Old Testament text. The research is just it's candy. It's really so much fun. And now, having said that, though, that means that I'm not as familiar with this material as I am, like I was with the prophetic material that we dealt with last year. So I'm going to be a little bit more bound to what I have down here than I usually have. So I apologize. I apologize for that part. All right, I've got enough caveats out there now. I think French horn players do that all the time. I'm sure to make a mistake. All right, I'm curious. Give me some names of some parables.
Good Samaritan.
Okay, some others.
Prodigal son.
What else?
Mustard seed.
Parable of the empty house.
Empty house. Which one is that? I don't recognize that title.
About the man who leaves the house unoccupied.
Oh. All right.
Widow's mite.
That's the one about the bug. Talents, yeah. And I love to preach on that one because in English you can play with that so well. And it works, it's consistent in many ways with that. That's pretty good. That's not bad. But so there was a bit of a pause there. We'll surprise people didn't come up with the sower. That usually shows up pretty quickly. But there are, let's see, I've got this number. There are 43 parables in the Gospels. And let me explain something right off the bat. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. Now, we're going to see pretty quickly here that what constitutes a parable is a matter of a lot of debate. And so, depending on how we define a parable, we might say, oh, there's some of these things in the Gospel of John. But for the most part, and we can be very comfortable in saying, when you think of parables, think of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is in John's world, the magnificent gospel that it is, a very different way of looking at these things. Parables are one of the three major forms of Jesus' stories. Another type of story that he had, and we're going to define this more carefully in a second, but certainly they are stories. Well, mostly. I just realized, yeah, I've got to qualify that too. But the other stories that Jesus taught, there's another category that this guy named Rudolf Bultmann called pronouncement stories. And the pronouncement stories are the story of Jesus interacting with some people, and actually, come to think of it, these are stories about Jesus. They're not ones that he tells, but they're stories in the teaching that is the Word of God. And in pronouncement stories, there's interactions between Jesus and somebody else, and then a pronouncement, a saying of some kind. Like the fox has holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Something like that. That would be a pronouncement. And everything before it builds to that particular thing. The other type, of course, are miracle stories, which play a very, very important role in Jesus' ministry, and also in our theology, our understanding of who Jesus is, also in relationship to God. All right, now, that's the simple part. And this, what we're going to cover today may not be as, well, let's just say, I hope you had a lot of coffee. Because there's some technical background we've got to cover here. In order, my main job, let me tell you this right off, as I see it, is to help you appreciate the diversity, the complexity, the wonder of these things that we call parables. So that's where I'm headed on this. There are parables in the Old Testament. Not just in the New Testament itself, they're also there. And because of that, it already, the notion of what we think a parable is in the Bible gets really muddy. And in fact, the Old Testament calls these things, it's in translation, we translate it as parable. That's a soft sound, it's mashal. Okay, actually, M-A-S-H. No, here, it's mashal. That's the word that is often translated as parable in the Old Testament. That seems fine and dandy until we look at the title of the book that we call Proverbs, and it's Meshalim. So it's Proverbs, parables. Oh, wait a minute now. That seems very different from the story, like the prodigal son. And then here, in the book of Proverbs, if you've not been into there recently, this is part of what we call the wisdom tradition. And it's, like the wisdom of a father sitting his daughter or son on his leg and giving them the advice about don't spit into the wind, don't pull the mask off the old Lone Ranger, don't mess around with Jim. Actually, that really does kind of work. It is like that. That's called proverb. Proverbs, we call Proverbs parable in Hebrew. So, this is a bit of a mess. So, one of the first challenges we've got here is, and the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament understanding of parable. Okay. And then we've got this is the real sticky wicket, as the Brits would say. And it's a matter of a lot of debate, and still today among New Testament scholars. What is the relationship between parable and allegory? We're going to address these questions, but there's parables, allegories, parables. And it's the answer to that question is not simple at all. Again, we'll work with the definitions of it. So I always like to go back to roots, and at least I get to write Greek once in a blue moon. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the origin of the term parable, and to the 4th century before the Common Era, BC, to this dude named Aristotle. He's not the first. The Old Testament, of course, it with Mashal precedes Aristotle, But he was the first one to give us the Greek, and actually what we would consider to be a more formal understanding of this very interesting, complex thing. And the way, where we find this, and this is in Rhetoric, and it's called the Rhetoric by Aristotle, which actually is really fascinating. So many of our principles of argumentation, you know, about how to make a case, literally, how to make a case, whether it's for our spouse or whether it is in front of a jury. Sometimes the two are, well, anyway. In the Rhetoric, he talks about the use of examples in order to make a case, to make a point. And when he does that, he talks about two different kinds of examples. One is fables, all right, and the other are parables, parabola, and the singular parable. Well, Bear, I can't speak today. Now, let's talk first of all about fables. Now, some of us, I hope you can see this. When I found this online, I just kind of went, oh yeah, Saturday mornings, you know, I remember this. I hope, for those of you who can't see it, this is the Looney Tunes version of Tortoise and the Hare. All right? This fits his understanding of a fable, and I'm going to read to you, in translation, of course, the Tortoise and the Hare. This is one of Aesop's fables, a classic one. A hare was making fun of the tortoise one day for being slow. Do you ever get anywhere? He asked with a mocking laugh. Well, yes, replied the tortoise, and I get there sooner than you think. I'll run you a race and prove it. I'd forgotten that the tortoise actually challenged the hare. I didn't know that, I forgot. Oh, the hare was much amused at the idea of running a race with the tortoise, but for the fun of the thing, he agreed. So the fox, who had consented to act as judge, marked the distance and started the runners off. Well, the hare was soon far out of sight, and to make the tortoise feel very deeply how ridiculous it was for him to try to race with a hare, he lay down beside the course to take a nap until the tortoise should catch up. You know, hence Bugs, who looks like he's had a lot of carrots. The tortoise, meanwhile, just kept going slowly but steadily, and after a time he passed the place where the hare was sleeping. But the hare slept on very peacefully. And when at last he did wake up, the tortoise was near the goal. And the hare ran his swiftest, but he could not overtake the tortoise in time. Okay, now, do a little scholarly work here. What are the characteristics of that kind of story? First of all, we establish as a story.
Fable has an animal.
Okay.
Animals as characters.
Typical, yeah, in this case at least, animals as characters. Characters who act, in this case, like human beings. They're anthropomorphic.
Overconfident.
Okay, yeah, and there's, so we've got some, you know, some exaggeration here. Yeah, you know, like, really, you know, okay? So the overconfidence here, though, Smitty, that's one of the concepts that's being wrestled with in this. That, you know, there's this particular attitude, a human disposition, okay, that is the subject, maybe, of the fable. So it's dealing with the particular concept. The purpose of the fable is to wrestle with overconfidence, maybe something close, otherwise close to that. It's pretty good. What does it do with it?
Bite you.
Say it again?
It bites you.
It bites. How so?
Well, it brings you to your senses that you're really not as sharp as you thought you were.
Okay, yeah, it kind of slaps us into alertness. Yeah, bites us on the bottom, as it were.
It's a lesson about human foibles.
Yes.
Fox and the grapes and
Yeah, and so in these simple stories, they've got a bit of a punch to them. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to point to right now is that Tom.
This also be interpreted as people putting things off and saying, I've got this,
Procrastination.
I'll get it done, and then time comes, it's not done.
So there are at least two human propensities here that are being examined. You know, procrastination, of course, as a teacher, I never experienced that. Procrastination and also, you know, overconfidence. Okay, all right. So what we have here is a simple story that tries to drive home some points that are pretty basic to what it means to be human. Okay? But notice, we've got talking turtles and foxes and rabbits. Okay? And so, unless somebody's smoking something illegal, in most cases, they're not going to experience a talking tortoise.
How is this different from what you describe as allegory here?
Hang on, yes, hang on, we're going there. Thank you. Checks in the mail. That's exactly it. Okay, all right, now, first, before we get to allegory, we need to ask the question, are parables fables? First of all, let's deal with similarities for a second. Okay. Remember, Aristotle said that both of these things can be used to make a point, an illustration, an example, in order to make your case. Okay. How are they similar?
Moral, they both teach a lesson
Okay.
in the story.
Exactly. They're both, depending on how heated the debate is, either a weapon or certainly a major tool in teaching a point, in teaching a lesson. Good. Anything else?
A simple story has a larger meaning.
Okay, so the story, where this thing is headed is always bigger than what the story is. Good. All right. Differences. Now, let's talk about the differences between fables and parables.
Wouldn't a fable lead to kind of one conclusion, like the fox and the grapes and the tortoise and the hare?
Mm-hmm.
It teaches the lesson quite simply. In the parable, you're comparing things. And then in the allegory is a one-to-one correspondence between different characters in the story.
Well, there you go.
Representing something
Okay.
else.
So
And the meaning is more complex in a
Okay.
parable, like
All right.
the prodigal son,
mhm.
particularly the ending.
And a lot of scholars will say that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a parable will have just one point. But the point, simple point, huge meaning. Okay. Now, procrastination and overconfidence, these are powerful things, part of the human experience. But when we are talking about the incomparability of God's grace or love, we've just moved, all puns intended, to a whole different level. Okay? All right? Anything else, real obvious, quick difference?
Parables kind of deal with secular issues, where parables may deal more with religious issues.
Oh, yeah, and the fables too. Well, yes, especially if we're dealing with Old and New Testament ones, by all means. So, again, then that makes good sense, because we're dealing with more complex types of ideas, and we move into the realm of faith, religion. Again, conceptually, that's just dynamite. Do you know of any parables that have animals in them?
The sheep, lost sheep.
Okay, but does that sheep talk? No. Okay, so, no anthropomorphic representations here. There is a realism in the parables, and we're going to talk about the important role that plays. That's going to also have to do with comparison between these things in allegories. Okay? In fact, well, let's go ahead and talk about that. Sorry. All right, let's stop and talk for a second, and you gave us a great definition of allegory. Let's go ahead and go with that again. Give us that definition again.
It's a one-to-one correspondence between different characters or objects in the story that have a secondary meaning, two meanings.
Right, and so, in an allegory, this is a particular character, maybe, this is going to be our story. Here's our character, okay? And in an allegory, the characters and the things they do more obvious things, not the little stuff, but the bigger things, they all point to a specific type of meaning.
Pilgrim's Progress.
Okay, yeah. And the, that's one of the classic ones within our tradition. This gets to a real sharp contrast between allegories and parables, generally speaking. All right, notice I'm qualifying that, sorry, that's my world. We're gonna get to this, but there are some allegorizations of parables in the New Testament where the interpretation actually takes different main characters and events and interprets them symbolically, to point to these different things. But generally speaking, with the parables, they're getting to a main point where you don't have each the characters or the activities representing something else. The main point, the story point, is the point of the parable. That's where Jesus, or possibly those from the Old Testament, the authors from the Old Testament, want us to go. Okay, so, but there's something else too, and this gets into. Well, I'm going to shorten this part. You can. Do I hear an amen? Actually, I should have erased my excellent drawing there of the representation of an allegory. Who were Jesus' primary audience for his teachings?
They were Jewish people.
Jewish people. What kind of people? Wait.
Illiterate?
Illiterate. Yeah. Peasants. People who lived even worse than paycheck to paycheck, from harvest to harvest. Okay. Now this doesn't mean we know that Jesus used his parables in arguments with the Pharisees sometimes, and they would have been incredibly learned, very educated. The most educated people actually within the Jewish community, the Pharisees would have been. Past the Sadducees, of course that was the point of some contention between.
But they didn't have his resource.
What's that?
They didn't have his resource.
Yeah. Help me understand what you mean.
When Jesus was preaching the parables to the higher ups, they didn't have the resources he had to pull from.
That's true. Yeah, he had a leg up on
Right.
that, by all means. Well, the reason I asked about the primary audience for Jesus' parables, this has an important implication for whether Jesus' parables were allegories or not, or meant to be interpreted allegorically. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week too. But if I'm the typical audience member for Jesus' teachings, and Jesus' teachings are allegories, well, what good is that going to be to me? Absolutely none. Allegories, knowing that something is an allegory and trying to interpret it at that level, say, oh, okay, this represents this and this represents that, this would be lost on the peasants of Palestine. Okay? So those of us who always are a little worried about the allegorization of Jesus' parables and so on, and by the way, that happens fairly frequently in the pulpit. I've done it, I'm not saying it's wrong, but we've got to be real careful to remember that most likely when we find allegories or allegorical interpretations in the New Testament, what we might be seeing there is the hand of the early church talking about the meaning that it saw within the parables. I'll give some examples of that next week. But you see the problem here. If allegories are very sophisticated types of stories, if they're going to function. And by the way, I don't want to miss this real important point. The purpose of parables is to teach. You really don't want to miss that. And the question is if we say that, well, the allegories are parables, then who is Jesus teaching? Or it would have actually made him a very ineffective teacher for him to use allegories with peasants. No. So there are wonderful people who disagree on that too. Okay, good, and we have to stop. I'm sorry. We'll get started maybe a little bit earlier next week. Well, what I want you to be thinking about, start breezing through your New Testament, or maybe you've got some other source. Actually, you can go online and just look up parable, and you'll find a whole list of them. Acquaint yourself with some of the parables, and we're going to be looking at, well, we're going to be looking at a lot of them, but especially the sower, what I call the elder brother, not the prodigal son, because it's the older brother I identify with. Also, yeah, the parable of the sower, the prodigal son, those are a good start. If you really want to explore and go become heady about it, look at Galatians 4:21 through 31. This is where Paul interprets Sarah and Hagar's story allegorically. So, all right, we'll see you then. God be with you all.
Thank you very much.